The conference room was colder than usual, not from the air conditioning, but from the way people glanced at me then quickly away. I took my usual seat near the end of the long oval table, setting down my notebook with the same quiet precision I'd practiced for years. I glanced at the printed agenda in front of me. My name wasn't on it. That in itself wasn't alarming. I wasn't often invited to present in these meetings, only to listen, absorb, and occasionally explain numbers someone else would later claim credit for. But today felt different. Everyone seemed too alert, too still, the kind of tension that comes before something breaks. Across from me, Darren Malk, my boss, our marketing director and self-declared visionary, stood with one hand in his pocket and the other flipping casually through slides, already preloaded on the screen. He wasn't even looking at them. He was scanning the room like a man about to perform. My stomach tightened. I'd like to begin today's meeting by acknowledging everyone's contributions to this quarter's growth, he said with that practiced smile. Everyone here matters to this company. He paused just long enough to build anticipation, except the marketing disaster. A beat of silence. Then the laughter began, scattered at first, then rippling in waves, some nervous, others genuine. It was the kind of laughter people offer when they know they should object, but fear rocking the boat. I didn't laugh. I didn't blink. My ears rang, but my spine held straight. I stared at the projector screen and pretended I didn't hear my name, not being said, but being targeted. The worst part wasn't Darren. It was how easy it was for the others to go along with it. That morning, Leora had accidentally forwarded me an email thread. I doubted she meant to. Maybe she hadn't even read it fully before clicking forward. It had been a reply chain between Darren and the former COO, still copied on a few internal emails. The line had read, "Let's use today to cut the dead weight, marketing's dead weight." I'd read it 3 times before deleting it from my inbox. I hadn't responded. I hadn't warned anyone. I didn't even forward it to my personal email. I just printed a copy of something else instead. The folder was already in my bag when I walked into the meeting. I waited until Darren clicked to the next slide, launching into quarterly projections, as though he hadn't just publicly reduced me to a punchline. I stood. The room stilled. Darren paused mid-sentence. I walked to the front of the room, opened my bag, and pulled out a slim blue folder. I laid it on the center of the conference table, perfectly aligned with the company logo. "For the board," I said. Then I walked out. I didn't run, but my steps were quick measured. The moment the elevator doors closed behind me, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. My hands were still cold, the kind of cold that starts in your chest and leaks into your fingers. By the time I reached the front doors of the building, I could feel the adrenaline wearing off, leaving behind a shaky hollowness. I stepped into the sunlight, its warmth almost mocking, and made it to the far end of the parking lot before I heard the footsteps. Fast, heavy, getting closer. I stopped, turned. Alina Wythe, our CEO, was rushing toward me, heels clicking unevenly across the pavement, clutching the blue folder I had left on the table. "Soraya," she called out. "Wait." She stopped just short of me, chest rising and falling harder than I'd ever seen from her. Alina was the type who moved through rooms like a glass of still water, elegant, measured, unreadable. But now she looked shaken. "You can't just leave," she said, voice tight. "We need to talk." I crossed my arms, not out of defiance, but to stop myself from trembling. "Now you want to talk." She held up the folder slightly. "I've seen enough to know we should have talked much sooner." I left that there because words weren't working anymore. I said, because emails got ignored, because being early, staying late, solving everything quietly, none of it mattered, until I walked out. Her eyes didn't blink. "You built something the rest of us didn't see, but it's there. In this folder." "No," I corrected. "It's in the clients who call me, not the department. It's in the people who stayed because they trusted me, not the system." Alina looked down just briefly. "Then back up." Come upstairs. 30 minutes. I'm not asking you to stay. I just want to understand exactly what's at stake." I paused. Not because I was considering it, but because I needed her to know something. I'm not coming back to ask for anything I said. If I walk back into that building, it's not to negotiate for scraps. "I wouldn't have asked you to," she said. I looked past her toward the windows of the conference room several floors above us. The blinds were shut now. Good. Let them sit in their silence. 30 minutes, I said finally. She nodded, stepped aside to let me walk ahead of her. She didn't try to lead, not this time. Back in the elevator, the silence was no longer awkward. It was observant. When we entered her office, she set the folder on a low table, not her desk, and gestured to one of the chairs near the window, the one that faced her as an equal. I sat, and she did too, folding her hands carefully. "Tell me," she said, "how this happened without anyone noticing." I looked her straight in the eye. "Because you were all looking at Darren." 3 years ago, I walked into Altitude Marketing Solutions with a borrowed blazer, a brand new degree, and the kind of hunger that makes you believe hard work will always speak for itself. It didn't. In the beginning, I stayed late to impress. Then I stayed late to catch up. Eventually, I stayed late because I knew no one else would fix what was broken if I didn't. Decks with typos, client files, misplaced proposals that Darren would promise by Friday. And start on Thursday night, I cleaned up all of it. Silently. I trained new hires even when it wasn't part of my job description. I coached junior account managers through their first calls. I rewrote campaign pitches on Sunday nights so they'd sound smarter in Darren's voice on Monday morning. And when he pitched my strategy to the board word for word, including the anecdote I had told him over coffee, I said nothing. I sat in the back of the room and watched him get the applause hands in his pockets as if brilliance were effortless. That was the last time I expected anyone to give me credit. I stopped fighting the system and started learning how to navigate around it. When a client reached out after hours, I gave them my personal number. In case it's urgent, I'd say. But they didn't just call in emergencies. They called to ask questions, to request edits, to vent, to trust. I started cataloging it all: emails with praise, screenshots of texts, meeting notes with my name circled and my ideas underlined. I built folders named by client, color-coded and dated. I kept a backup of everything Darren deleted from shared drives. At first, it was just a handful of clients who came directly to me, then a dozen. By the end of my second year, 17 of our top 20 accounts were bypassing official channels and messaging me first. The office still saw me as the assistant, the fixer, the person who double-checked final drafts. But our clients, they knew who made their campaigns work. They knew who stayed up until 2 a.m. when their product launch site crashed. I didn't advertise any of it. I didn't need to. Quiet power grows differently. It doesn't shout, it accumulates. And just in case one day someone tried to erase all of it, I gave that backup folder a name that felt like armor. If they ever forget who I am, I didn't realize I would one day need to open it. Not until others started telling me the same story in their own voices. I used to think I was the only one hiding their own brilliance out of survival. But once I started paying attention, I realized I was surrounded by people doing the same, smart, capable people whose names never made it into the slides, but whose fingerprints were on everything that worked. Eaton Harlow had been the creative mind behind our most viral campaign, the one that landed us 2 new tech clients in a single quarter. I remember watching Darren present it at an industry conference, calling it his instinctive breakthrough. Eaton stood in the back, arms folded, face unreadable. He clapped when everyone else did. Then he went back to his desk and kept designing. Naveen Solis built the analytics dashboard that turned our reporting process from chaos to clarity. The dashboard was now branded as a senior innovation initiative, complete with a logo Darren slapped on top. The only person who ever thanked Naveen directly was me, and that was usually through Slack. And Delia Thorne Delia was the architect behind our best-performing client engagement system. She quietly reworked our entire customer onboarding process over 6 months, smoothing out pain points that no one else had even bothered to notice. Darren referred to it in leadership calls as the Thorne model, as if that acknowledgement alone made up for how he spoke over her in meetings. We all knew. We all whispered. The frustration lived in the spaces between us, side glances when a manager took credit, sighs in the kitchen when a project was praised with the wrong name, attached careful venting after hours at dive bars, or inside chat threads labeled drafts so they wouldn't be flagged. But no one ever did anything, not until I left that blue folder on the table. That night, I messaged each of them separately. I didn't explain much. I just said, things are changing. If I'm going in, I'm not going alone. Eaton was the first to reply. Say when. Delia's answer came next. Finally. Naveen sent just one line. Let's burn the old blueprint. We met the next day unofficially in the unused training room at the end of the hall. We didn't shout. We didn't scheme. We aligned. They reviewed my proposal draft, added metrics, systems names. We pulled reports, outlined roles, traced every client back to the real relationship holders. We didn't need permission. We already had the proof. When we finished, I looked around the table and realized something I hadn't let myself believe until that moment. I wasn't just doing this for me anymore. I was doing it with them. And we were ready. The boardroom was as silent as I expected it to be when I walked in behind Alina. 10 polished faces looked up, some surprised, others immediately guarded. Darren was already seated at the table, one arm thrown casually over the back of his chair, the other tapping a capped pen against his thigh. He didn't blink when he saw me, just tilted his head slightly like I was an unexpected but unthreatening guest at his dinner party. Alina took her seat at the head. I remained standing. I'd like to begin by addressing a structural issue that has quietly undermined our client operations for the past 3 years, I said. No pleasantries, no preamble. I opened my laptop connected to the screen and walked them through what they never bothered to look at. Client messages, direct praise, requests to work only with me. I showed screenshots of 2 a.m. troubleshooting texts about campaign emergencies, last-minute pivots that saved accounts. I explained how the attribution model in our CRM listed Darren as primary contact for 17 top-tier clients, yet only 3 of those clients had spoken to him in over a year. Then I gave them a glimpse of the system I proposed. For a moment, the room was still. Then Darren stood up. She's support, he said smoothly. I'm the face, the relationship builder, the reason clients come to us in the first place. A few board members shifted in their seats. One of them, a woman named Madeline, who had barely glanced at me when I walked in, flipped through her folder again. Her expression darkened. Another opened to the tab, labeled Client Testimony, Westridge. I didn't look at Darren. I clicked to the final slide. I'd like to play a voicemail, I said. It was short, just 11 seconds. We're only staying with altitude because of Soraya. If she leaves, we're going with her. Silence. The real kind. Not polite, not strategic, just still. Alina spoke next, her voice neutral but firm. The recommendation is as follows: a new department, Client Relationship Services, led by Soraya Velen, effective immediately. She turned slightly. Darren will be reassigned to lead generation and new business outreach. All existing accounts will be transitioned over the next 30 days. The vote was unanimous. No discussion, no abstention. I closed my laptop, slowly slid it into my bag, and nodded once. Outside the room, the air felt heavier somehow, like the building itself had shifted beneath its foundation. Alina walked beside me in silence, and for the first time, it was Darren who followed. By Monday, the silence in the office had changed. It wasn't indifference anymore, it was fear. Controlled, professional, clipboard-holding fear. People who used to speak over me in meetings now chose their words carefully. Some avoided eye contact. A few didn't come in at all. 2 senior managers submitted their resignations within 48 hours. Neither gave reasons, but everyone understood. The upcoming audit of client relationships would strip their facades clean, and they didn't want to stay long enough to watch the illusion unravel. That week, I stood in front of the entire staff in the main conference room. This time, not at the edge of the table, not on the sidelines, but beside Alina. I announced the formal creation of the Client Relationship Services Department and introduced the leadership team. Etan Harlow will lead creative strategy, I said. Murmurs. Delia Thorne is now head of engagement. A few audible inhales. Naveen Solis will oversee analytics and retention. I saw one of the project leads, the one who used to call Naveen Data Boy, blink 3 times in a row and look down. No applause. Just quiet comprehension. The rest of the week was spent on recalibration. I spoke with clients one-on-one video calls, phone calls, even one rooftop coffee meetup. I asked them what names they relied on, who they emailed when it mattered, who made things easier, faster, better. The same names surfaced again and again. Most of them were people no one on the executive floor had ever mentioned. I compiled the data, realigned the accounts. Staff were reassigned based on actual relationship strength, not title. And Darren, he tried. He kept his shoulders back, his suits sharp, his voice firm. But it was different now. The team that once fed him research strategy and insight no longer answered his calls at midnight. There was no one left to polish his gaps. 3 weeks in, he showed up at my door. I can't close deals without backup, he said, leaning on the frame like he didn't want to come all the way in. You're not supposed to, I replied. That's the whole point. Let's build something where no one has to fake it. He hesitated, then nodded once. We brought him in not as a lead, but as a contributor. All credit tracked, all roles defined, and he showed up. Not perfectly, but he showed up. 3 months passed and the numbers spoke louder than I ever had to. Staff turnover had dropped to the lowest it had been in 4 years. People stopped whispering in the hallways and started staying late because they wanted to, not because they were afraid not to. Feedback became transparent. Recognition was no longer rationed to those with the loudest voices. It was earned, measured, and shared. Client retention rose by 23%, and not one of our top 20 accounts had requested a change in contact. In fact, several had expanded their contracts. One even cited staff integrity and stability as the reason for renewing at double their original budget. Performance bonuses were no longer negotiated behind glass doors. We tied them directly to client-verified impact, actual work, not reputation. For the first time, people who kept their heads down and delivered consistent excellence were being paid like they mattered, because they did. I was sitting at my desk, still the same desk, though the title plate had changed when Alina stopped by. She didn't knock, didn't linger, just held out a slim folder with her name already signed on the corner tab. The board wants you to consider something, she said. I opened it. Inside, a formal offer to become Chief Client Officer with a seat on the board. I read it once, closed the folder. I thought about that first year eating lunch at my desk while watching others take credit for my numbers. About sitting in Darren's shadow while executives praised his instinct. About the folder I once labeled, "If they ever forget who I am." I looked up at Alina. "I'll take it," I said. "But only if I can keep building forward, not just upward." Her mouth curved slightly. "That's why it's yours." She walked away without another word. I turned the folder over in my hands and glanced at the names on our latest client retention dashboard. Delia Eaton Naveen. Others who used to be footnotes in meetings and were now signatures on major contracts. This wasn't about a seat at the table anymore. It was about expanding the table itself. About making sure the next Soraya didn't have to build a folder to prove she belonged. About culture, not just structure. I tucked the offer into my drawer, locked it, and turned back to my screen. An email from a West Coast partner, blinking with urgency. Expansion was coming. The annual summit looked different this year. There were no towering egos at the mic, no vague speeches about synergy or growth potential. Just people tired, talented, finally seen. I stood at the front of the room, the light from the ceiling warm but not blinding, and spoke into the kind of silence that listens. I didn't talk about quarterly numbers or strategy shifts. I talked about names. Delia Thorne, whose engagement model had quietly kept clients returning for years. Ethan Harlow, whose creative campaigns had gone viral without his name ever appearing on the credits. Naveen Solis, who rebuilt the analytical core of our company while most executives barely knew what he looked like. I called them up one by one, let them speak, and watched the room recognize them in real time. When I closed the ceremony, I didn't thank the board or the shareholders. I said, real power is what happens when we build systems that don't need heroes, only honesty. The applause came slowly, then built. Not the kind of clapping people do out of obligation, the kind that carries weight. Afterward, as people milled about, shaking hands and pulling each other into small circles of congratulations, Darren approached. He wasn't smiling, but his posture wasn't defensive either. "You were never a failure in marketing," he said. I looked at him. Just looked. Then I nodded once, because that was all that needed to be said. He turned and walked back toward the reception table, blending into a room that now knew who he wasn't. Later that evening, I stood in my office, the one with the floor-to-ceiling windows and the corner view of Denver's skyline. The city shimmered in quiet motion, small lights doing big work. I pressed a hand against the glass and let the silence settle. I didn't get revenge. I rewrote the system. The annual summit drew every department head, every regional lead, and every partner we'd cultivated over the past year. For the first time, we didn't open with a speech from the founder or a highlight reel of flashy acquisitions. We opened with the numbers that had once been hidden in dashboards, client retention, staff engagement, and the names of the people responsible for both. I stood at the podium without a script. I didn't need one. I spoke about patterns, the ones we inherit, the ones we survive, and the ones we choose to break. I spoke about invisible labor and the cost of silence. And then I named them. Delia Thorne, whose engagement model had reduced client churn by nearly 40%. Ethan Harlow, whose creative campaigns had turned feedback into fan bases. Naveen Solis, whose insights predicted client exits before they happened. They stood when I called their names. The applause was real earned, not instructed. I ended with a single line that had come to define everything I believed. Real power is what happens when we build systems that don't need heroes, only honesty. The applause swelled. Not polite, not rehearsed. The kind that made my chest ache a little from how long I'd gone without it. As the room emptied into catered hallways and congratulatory huddles, I made my way to the back corner near the exit. That's when Darren approached. No entourage, no performance. He stood in front of me, uncertain. "You were never a failure in marketing," he said, almost like it hurt to say it. I looked at him, nodded once, and said nothing. He didn't wait for more. Just turned and left, leaving me with the kind of silence that felt like closure, not emptiness. Later that night, I stood in my office, the city lights below blinking like a quiet chorus. The view hadn't changed, but everything else had. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady, certain, whole. I didn't get revenge, I whispered to myself. I rewrote the system. And somewhere in the building, I knew someone was working late on a project no one had noticed yet, wondering if they mattered. They did. They would. Because now the system knew where to look.